First, 4 Israeli hostages were freed in a daring rescue at the weekend, leaving leftists around the world heartbroken. I'm serious. While Israel celebrated the rescue of its citizens from the clutches of maniacal terrorists, many around the Western world were upset, even appalled. British newspaper columnist Owen Jones was disgusted that anyone would celebrate Jews being saved from captivity. In a tweet that Pharaoh himself would have approved, Owen said, "This is a grave, grave war crime. Shame on those celebrating it." Meanwhile, Australian broadcaster Clementine Ford, well, she slammed the IDF for being gleeful at saving Jews.
You know, there is really something so ghoulish about a regime that has done so many horrific things already, but almost seems like gleeful about outdoing themselves. To disguise combatants as humanitarian aid, to slaughter 200 people.
It's simply insane that people are mad at Israel for rescuing the hostages rather than being mad at Hamas for taking hostages in the first place. They also seem surprised that using civilians to hide hostages in high-density residential areas full of civilians endangers civilians. Well, who knew? The ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, reported on the amazing news of hostages being rescued like this. Breaking: hostage rescue. Gazan authorities say at least 210 Palestinians killed and 400 wounded during heavy bombardment of camp during rescue of the 4 Israelis. It's a perverse emphasis, isn't it? Lamenting the number of captors killed rather than the number of captives freed. For the record, Israel claims about 100 Palestinians were killed in the rescue operation, including terrorists. They also claim that Hamas fighters used rocket grenade launchers in the firefight that ensued. Now, this is just me spitballing, but I'd say that using grenade launchers in a built-up area is probably not the greatest idea when you're super worried about civilian casualties. Then again, since when has Hamas ever worried about Palestinian deaths? Which is why they hid hostages in the tightly packed residential area of Nuseirat. A lot of people were outraged that civilians imprisoning the hostages were killed in the Israeli raid. Well, here's my contrarian take on the situation. Don't hold Israeli hostages in your apartment. After all, research shows that holding Israeli hostages is tightly correlated with reduced life expectancy. Australian actor Guy Pearce, who will always have a special place in our hearts for his role as Mike Young in Neighbours, tweeted, "I'm pleased hostages are home, but let's not be distracted and forget all about the unnecessary Palestinian deaths." See, this is why you shouldn't drink Hamas Kool-Aid. It makes you stupid. What did Guy Pearce think bring them home meant? Vibes, memes, essays? And what does he mean by don't let the rescue of hostages be a distraction? The rescue of hostages has been the entire point since they were captured 246 days ago. Honestly, I thought of all people, Guy Pearce, starring in a show called Neighbours, would have understood how important it is for Israel to secure its boundaries when living next door to a terrorist camp. While we're on the subject of fictional actors, the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese tweeted, "Relieved that 4 hostages have been released." Yeah, I bet she is. Let's see just how relieved. She goes on to say, "It should not have come at the expense of at least 200 Palestinians, including children, killed and over 400 injured by Israel and allegedly foreign soldiers while perfidiously hiding in an aid truck." Well, the Israeli soldiers wouldn't have had to perfidiously hide in an aid truck if Hamas terrorists had not perfidiously hidden hostages in a residential apartment block, or if they had not perfidiously taken hostages in the first place. By the way, if you don't know what perfidious means, it means treacherous. Kind of like a UN court contemplating the arrest of an Israeli Prime Minister for doing whatever it takes to rescue hostages. Francesca Albanese continued, "Israel has used hostages to legitimise killing, injuring, maiming, starving and traumatising Palestinians in Gaza." What? You mean like how the Allies used Jews in concentration camps to legitimise killing, injuring and maiming Germans in Berlin? The UN Special Rapporteur finished with this. Israel could have freed all hostages alive and intact 8 months ago when the first ceasefire and hostage exchange was put on the table. Honestly, some things are so stupid you'd have to be a UN official to say them. I mean, she's right, of course. Israel could have had all hostages back 8 months ago if only they'd agreed to have October 7 repeated 1,000 times over, as this Hamas official promised.
انه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مرة ثانية وثالثة، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثاني وثالث ورابعة، لأنه احنا لدينا إصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا إمكانيات.
Here's how Al Jazeera reported the miraculous rescue of Israeli hostages. Death toll from Nuseirat attack rises to 210. Nuseirat attack? If you didn't know better, which if you watch Al Jazeera means you wouldn't, you'd assume that evil Israelis just attacked Nuseirat for the hell of it. Oh, and it turns out that one of the civilians holding 3 of the hostages captive in his apartment was a journalist who'd written for Al Jazeera. Funny that. While we're on bad media takes, a BBC journalist asked a former Israeli military commander, straight-faced, why the Israelis didn't let Hamas know that they were on their way to save the hostages. You know, so the whole rescue could have been done nicely.
There are reports of women, of children who are among the dead. It is appearing to be a high civilian death toll. Would there have been a warning to those civilians for them to get out on time?
For sure, of course, we cannot anticipate Israel to be warning ahead of a raid to extract or to save hostages, because then what the terrorists would do is to kill the hostages.
Now, I know it's a rough day for the left-leaning media when Jewish hostages are rescued, but they could at least try to contain their disappointment. Speaking of people having a hard time coping, Greens leader Adam Bant tweeted, "We want all hostages released, we want all political prisoners released, and we want to know how the killing of 200-plus Palestinians in last night's attack can be justified." Well, Mr Bant, Hamas set the price. Let's hope and pray no Australians are ever kidnapped by a rapey terrorist cult, while the Greens have a say on policy. How hard is it to understand that you can't take hostages from their beds, keep them kidnapped for 8 months, and then complain about the rescue operation? Now we wait for Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to congratulate Israel on successfully freeing the hostages from the hands of bloodthirsty terrorists. Any moment now. We live in a world in which black is white, up is down, and moral clarity is nowhere to be seen. But thank God Noah Agamani, Elmog Miajan, Andrei Kozlov and Shlomi Ziv are home with their families tonight.